Salam, this is Ramala Hubb'Allah. I am here to talk about the future of countries today. And this is one of my projective, futuristic talks, a vision, an idea, a tiny TED talk that speculates about what could future countries look like in a time of climate change. Let me add that in. Okay. In the times of climate shift, I call it climate shift, not climate change. Climate shift. Excuse if I make any spelling mistakes because it's a little hard to hold the phone in one hand and write this stuff. I promise you I write better than this. So first let's tackle climate shift. So I've written this just to save some time. Climate shift versus climate change as it is being talked about, uh, versus climate shift as I understand. Now, it's very simple. In almost everything that I'm going to talk about in my lectures on ecology, I am going to inevitably make the point, which I have understood with some struggles, some observations, some failures of my expectations and fears also, which is good. Like the things didn't work out the way I thought they would, or the data wasn't adding up, or another thing was happening. People were not agreeing. And to me, this is always like intriguing. It's like half the people, you can say, were not agreeing, were not agreed upon, agreeing. Okay. They were not agreeing that things were as they were being stated by, as they said, one side. That got me intrigued. How is it that roughly half the population, like the other side, sees things differently? Could it be that there's a different reality? There is a spiritualism. There are certain spiritual teachings that say things like the voice of God, or the voice of people, it is the voice of God, right? So I think that's a spelling. If I'm wrong, we'll change it. Sometimes I forget spellings when I'm watching the whiteboard from behind a camera, so forgive me for that. So the voice of people is a voice of God. So there were these people who were saying, let's not scare us about climate and this and that. And so you could say, well, maybe these are people who ignore science, people who ignore reality. But it wasn't as simple as that. I also realized that not every nation contributes equally. Unequal contribution to climate issues. Not everybody experiences climate shift equally, and not everybody is getting worse off, and not everybody is getting better off. Normally, the climate change narrative goes something like that we are at this point in history and things are getting worse, right? But at that time, I used to laugh at the fact when some people, typically the conservatives, would say, well, you're talking about things going warmer, but actually getting cooler in some places. And I said, yeah, sometimes the cooling is an offsetting reaction, a temporary offsetting reaction to something hot. Like basically, for example, what happens is that if in a microclimate, air, for example, becomes very hot, then the air lifts up and cool air enters to offset the removal of hot air. And so temporarily you have a very cool breeze coming in, and like in a dust storm or something, when a dust storm comes, typically it's very cooling, like almost chilling sometimes. And you feel, wow, it's cooler. But it's actually, if hot air is being consistently generated or the surface is really hot, is going to make the next incoming air hot again, and so it's going to keep on heating. So you have to look at is the planet, is the surface really heating? Are there heat contributing factors or not? But at the same time, shift is not the same everywhere. So now, according to this linear narrative, things are just declining, and if things start declining, we just start shutting the whole thing down, and just it's just a shutdown model. which is something that understandably is a matter of huge concern and attention in the Western ecosphere, because the Western ecosphere is the one that has a military, industrial, and as I call them, pharmaceutical, not a pharmaceutical, but pharmaceutical superiority. And that is in a phase of adjustment. Like this thing is in a phase of decline and adjustment. So the Western people or thinkers are experiencing a decline, but this may not be the same everywhere in the world in terms of the socio-economic outcomes and impacts of climate, whatever it is, in terms of the responses or in terms of the shifts that people are going to make and how are they going to get in a more like are they going to dial their life down? What I realized was that elsewhere in the world, lives were already dialed down, like they were already here, and they are actually on the up. Not because they're like, oh, let's do something in response to climate shift, but they're more like, oh, we need social economic prosperity. Okay. There are people who have always been poor, who don't have roads, who don't have technology. And for them, the next thing in life, the thing that makes sense is this going up. And that creates a situation where they could potentially have energy demands. This is an interesting and complex situation, right? So I'm just mapping out the things that are happening and then things that are getting adjusted on the way. So if these once underdeveloped, undeveloped, or poor, as whatever you want to call them, economies and people, uh, were to take the path that the West took, and they would move towards trying to become military industrial societies, which some of them are becoming, but others are kind of adjusting them on the way and saying, well, you know what? It was the West that went ahead of all other humans and sort of invented this current model of living. And this model of living is in the decline. It's like you are a party of like four trekkers, right? Four people that are trekking east, west, north, south. And West went ahead. And West did a few things, like they developed a camping site, they picked some fruit or something, and everybody else was like, yeah, that's the path. But they were also warning you picking a lot of fruit at the camping site or whatever it is, and you're picking a fight with the bears or whatever. And then the West eventually went on a path of decline and said, well, I've used up the resources in the camping site ahead. I've picked a fight with the bears or whatever. Like there are troubles. Even if I don't make those troubles, temptation called me or I saw what I saw. But that thing is not what you are going to see when you follow me on the path. And that is actually natural anyway. Uh, what person one saw and met with is not what person two, three, four is going to meet with. So if a certain part of the world, one of the poles, took a certain path to development, doesn't mean we are going to take the same path to development, and the arc of that development will be the same, and the payoffs will be the same, and the costs will be the same. Even the costs are not the same, right? When somebody invented a computer for the first time, it cost a certain amount of money, and the computers were huge. Now you can make a computer for a fraction of a cost and a fraction of the size. So there's a learning curve, which thankfully the West has shared with the world. The West is generous this way. They shared their learnings with the world, did not keep it a secret. And so if anybody else wants to go on this path of development, the Western way, they would do it at a cheaper cost, which also leads to another risk that if they can do it cheaper and faster, maybe they'll do more of it. And that is one of the risks why nations are contesting each other. For example, China, as we know, can make a lot of things better and faster and cheaper than the West. So that gives a genuine competition and, in their view, a threat to the West. This is something that, for example, um, the American politicians are talking about right now. They've known it for a while. It has been politically incorrect to bring it up. And now people are saying, well, they have a de facto advantage. We do not have an advantage in the market anymore. So they learn things from us. They learned our military industrial way of life from us. They can do it better, uh, given the industriousness of their labor, given the fact that they are willing to do things cheaper, given the fact that they have a different work ethic, given the fact that they have different, mindsets, more dedication to work, maybe even more resources in some cases. Um, and they have certain mindset advantages. For example, they're good at mathematics, so they can do certain things better. Also, they might have better negotiation powers. If we don't have easy access to some minerals without colonizing them, they might be able to simply negotiate with other countries and say, would you trade your minerals with us in exchange for example, road development? And those people would say, yeah. For example, Africa would say, yeah, you develop our airports, we're going to give you our minerals. Ta-da! China can do it better. So there's that. So now we have like a competitiveness where there are other nations going towards a military industrial model. And then we compare that with the bedrock of all comparisons, not with each other, not with East, West, South, North, but with what is fundamental good for humanity. Okay? What is good for biology, what is good for our existence, fundamental good. And so some of the voices in the West, which are actually working with their own issues, and some of their thinkers, activists are saying, well, we need to live a simpler, easier way of life, saying, well, living a certain way or using certain kind of fuel is not uh, helpful to the planet or the ecology, is not fundamentally good. So let's stop using oil, for instance. Let's stop excessive dependence on oil, for instance. And there are other nations that are saying, nah, we're just about develop. We're just, we're developing just now. So why would we stop? I think in this case, the whole world needs a dialogue and say, well, you know what? Regardless of whether we are east, west, north, south, and who did what first, we all need to move towards fundamental good and remove competitiveness and harming each other or trying to outdo each other out of the equation. It's when we wish each other well and say, well, doesn't matter who started when, because every civilization before the West has had its go at its own colonization, growth, and development using the technologies and resources of their times and their eras. And they did what they did, and they were also, trying to at times take over the world. Some of them may have been benevolent, but mostly not so. So, this is a time in history when human beings everywhere are thinking, even though that has been a part of the philosophy and teachings of the faith and ways of life and philosophies and whatever of various cultures over almost the entirety of human history, they're thinking, well, let's get down to business. And the business is, if we really think about it, to do what's good for the planet. And that is what is going to do good for us. It doesn't matter who did what first, because all of us have been bad guys, right? This is what I think. I'm just speaking in easy peasy, layman, politically incorrect, almost uncomfortable terms. But this is what I think uh, the issue of our times, that we have to move towards fundamental good, which means everybody has got to start making some compromises. And also, there has to be an arc of development. Everybody has got to improve. Even the West doesn't have to take a plunge into some know nothingness and go back to cave eras or something. Some of that radical movement I started seeing some years ago, and I gotta say, I got really impressed. And I was almost like, wow, maybe we need to wander off into jungles. Not that. I think what we all need to do is scale down. So the West, which is already very expansive in its consumption per capita, needs to scale down. Now, per capita is an average, right? Per capita is an average. Capita is is average and does not show distribution of wealth. Distribution of wealth. Okay. If you really look at the map of wealth, you would see that there are a lot of people who have a lot of money. Not a lot of people, sorry, a few people who have a lot of money, and a lot of people who have very little money. So, one of the things that we need to do in any economy, any country, it's not just the West, we also have this issue in Arab nations, for example, we need to work on better distribution of wealth. So either we have a democratic structure or we have benevolent kingdoms where the kings or the rich people benevolently give to the common person. And that happens in some cultures. Like you would go there, it would be a welfare state. People might individually not be making a lot of money, but whoever their ruler or their government or a king or a queen are giving to their people. So it's a welfare state. People are happy. There is concentration of wealth at the top, but that is being given no conditions attached to the people. You would go to some of those kingdoms in modern times and even in the past where people of wealth and resources and kings, what they would do is they would build gardens, they would build waterways, they would build water fountains. It was like basically a welfare state, right? A welfare state. Now, a welfare state at that time, a good welfare state is not a state of entitled sick people. In fact, there is accountability in a good welfare state. There have, for instance, amongst Muslims, welfare states where people who were able-bodied were tasked with doing work, and the ruler could like literally ask them, "What's the problem with you? Like, why are you sitting waiting for welfare? So now you're not entitled to it." Well, that doesn't mean that you don't have like public parks and water fountains. That was like a human aspect that was available not just to for people, but for birds and animals as well, right? So the state would do such things as build places of rest and like give people food even sometimes. But in those economies, what happened was that most of the economy was not monetized, and obviously some of those were ancient times. People did not have the technology and infrastructure and access to accomplish things on their own. So the state controlled the resources, and then they would give to people on their own if they were good states. And so the people lived in peace, and they just made their happy little living, spinning wool or doing some cottage industry thing, while the state took care of the infrastructure, which often only the state can. It is in this day and age that we have technologies that are more distributed. We have people who are educated enough to do things on their own, municipalities which can do things on their own, towns that can do things on their own, and those towns are like interconnected. Like if in a state one town is doing something, they're interconnected with the other town so that the development does not become lopsided. And so one day one town says, well, we are so developed, we're going to attack somebody else, or some poor town says, well, we are not developed, what are we going to do? We're going to rob the other party. Things like that. All these things are like basically balancing of energy, right? If you look at the planet on a zoomed out level from a distance, we don't care for the labels. It's just energetic. There's this pole of the planet, here's the other pole of the planet. There's a lot of development taking place here, not enough development taking place there. Once these people find out that this place is more developed, they might want some, they might want to be like them or want to earn from them or want a share of them. Or if people get very developed, they would be like, oh, we are so developed. Now what do we do next? Let's start taking over other people. If they're not benevolently inclined, or they say, okay, let's start giving to other people. And the intended recipients may not always be ready, because sometimes the giver come with their own agendas, like, oh, your women are going to dress like our women. Or you're going to structure your society like our society. This is what the map of the issues is like. So we were talking about climate change versus climate shift, right? And I am going to get down to that in a minute, in the next part of this video.